Greetings, I'm Bill Klatke and I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of Neighborhood Beat. Our guest today is Mr. Antero Pietila, who is a journalist and author of a book that's just been released on Baltimore's racial history, housing, and community. Antero, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much for coming. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I came from Finland. Which is a country, when I was growing up in the 1940s and 1950s, it was so homogeneous that the biggest difference between its 4.5 million people was eye color and hair color. No blacks living in Finland in those days, 1,500 Jews. So you can imagine when I visited the United States for the first time in 1964, landed in New York City, I was flabbergasted at the variety of nationalities, religions, backgrounds.
I bet. That would be quite a shock. Finland's different now, though, right?
Every country is different. Finland is an aging country, has a wonderful social welfare system, and suddenly everybody realizes they cannot afford to keep it.
And so changes have to happen.
Correct.
And your book, though, is about changes that happen in Baltimore.
My book is about changes that happened in American cities over the last 130 years. Now, let me tell you what happens over the last 130 years. Starting in the 1880s, the first wave of suburbanization, what facilitates that are streetcars, first horsepower, then electrified, and then the automobile. And suddenly people have a choice. This happens at the same time when there are two things happening in cities: record immigration, European immigration, and a little bit later on, an influx of blacks from the South. And Baltimore experienced all that.
And you talk about that in your book?
I talk about all that.
We haven't given the name of your book.
My book is called Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City. The city, of course, is Baltimore. But this kind of succession, as the sociologists call it, it happened everywhere, in all cities. So it really is an all-American story.
Right. Something that happened in Louisville, New York, Chicago, you name it.
Every place.
You name it. And so as with streetcars and with private cars, all of a sudden people had the freedom to go wherever they wanted.
And during this time we had a couple of mighty social movements. We had the progressive political movement and we had eugenics. Eugenics being an offshoot of Darwinism. And basically what the eugenicists dealt with was a system of trying to categorize various races, nationalities, religions according to their desirability. And so my book really, it starts in 1910, 100 years ago, when Baltimore became the first city anywhere in the United States to enact a residential segregation law. Every block was segregated. Every block was designated either as white or black.
By law.
By law.
That's a dubious distinction for Baltimore.
It is a dubious distinction, but lots of cities, particularly in the old Confederacy, they copied Baltimore's law. And you mentioned Louisville earlier. This approach continued until 1917 when the Supreme Court invalidated a Louisville law that had been patterned after Baltimore's. And then the next chosen instrument for segregation were restrictive racial covenants. Homeowners getting together, concluding private agreements that they did not want certain nationalities or religious groups as their neighbors.
And they put that in their titles.
They put that in their titles. Roland Park was a forerunner in this, and this then continued until 1948 when the Supreme Court invalidated that approach. So 1948, then comes the school desegregation order in 1954, and that basically tells you the framework for the social change that we all have witnessed.
Right, and that great decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education.
Correct.
By the Warren Supreme Court. It reminded me of what President Eisenhower said later was, quote, the most damn fool thing he'd done was appointing Earl Warren Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Which is a very interesting thing because Warren, as I recall it, was announced in late August, and he was on the bench in September. So, I mean, whatever controversy people may have felt about Warren later on, it was not apparent when that happened.
But once the Supreme Court made it illegal to segregate public schools, then everything changed.
Everything changed, and it changed very drastically. Baltimore was the first big city, the first big city that not only desegregated immediately, but on a system-wide basis. Yet there was very little actual change in Baltimore that September. Now, there were half a dozen schools that changed, and among them was the Gwynns Falls Elementary School. It went from 0 to 44% black that September, and 1/6 of the white students withdrew during that academic year. So when the school reopened in 1955, the student body was 77% black. Meanwhile, Mandamin Mall was being constructed across the street from the school. When Mandamin opened 2 years after that, the school was 97% black. So you can see how rapid racial change was early on,
and how quickly it happened solely because of race. Nothing happened with the school itself.
Solely because of race, and people who may not have had any school-age children, they were as paranoid and as panicky as people who had school-age children.
Yeah, and of which various unscrupulous real estate operators then took advantage of. Yeah. And the story you tell, which is a fascinating story, and you tell it extremely well, and I know the book has been getting a lot of positive reception, is one that involves all aspects of the community.
Well, I worked for the Baltimore Sun for 35 years. I covered the city most of that time, and it occurred to me that there were lots of unanswered questions that nobody was either able to answer or was unwilling to answer. And I decided when I retired that I would answer those questions. And so what I have produced is basically a neighborhood and housing history, real estate history. But it also is a political history. It tells the story of an American city in the midst of racial change.
What were the questions you wanted to answer?
Well, for instance, why was it that in Baltimore the early pattern that was established seemed to suggest the following change in neighborhoods? From non-Jewish to African American. We can see this in 1910. This is what happened on McCullough Street, which was the trigger that caused the city council's segregation law. This was what happened in Ashburton. This was what happened along Liberty Road. And so what is the answer? The answer was that Baltimoreans, non-Jewish Baltimoreans, were so uneasy about Jewish people moving in that they started evacuating when that happened. And after neighborhoods became Jewish, if there was any kind of weakness in that real estate market, then those neighborhoods became targeted by blockbusters who basically wanted to buy cheap and flip the houses to blacks.
And therefore exacerbating or quickening the white flight.
Correct.
The remaining whites that had stayed,
right,
even with the Jewish influx.
Right.
And
now what contributed to this was financing. Basically, financing is the key in racial change and in stable neighborhoods. There was a PhD who came to work at the Social Security Administration in 1956, John Michener. He wanted to buy a house in a changing neighborhood, Windsor Hills. He says he went to 20 banks. Nobody wanted to lend to him because that neighborhood was seen to be going black. And he finally, as a personal favor from James W. Rouse, the developer, Rouse gave him a mortgage. But this is still a problem. Baltimore neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s was trying to establish a loan pool to introduce people of other race in neighborhoods that were changing. They were unable to get that type of money. A Philadelphia real estate broker established a nationwide fund in the 1960s. As of today, that fund is still operational, suggesting that it's still difficult for the underrepresented race to get financing in these kinds of situations.
And I guess the difficulty, though, is that it's not purely a matter of discrimination. It's also, in some cases, good financial behavior. It's not very responsible to the community. It's not responsible to ideals of harmony or of integration, but it's a good business decision.
Well, in my book, I talk about the history of all of this, and one of the turning points was in the mid-1930s, when the federal government under Franklin Roosevelt redlined 239 American cities, including Baltimore. Now, what did that mean? It meant that the federal government actually prepared maps with 4 colors. There were 2 desirable colors, green and blue, and the message to lenders was that these are desirable neighborhoods, these are good risks. You should be able to make loans at liberal terms even during the Depression, and be relatively assured that people would pay back. Now, there were 2 other colors. There was yellow, which was transitional, and then there was red. So when we look at 2 maps, and I have this contrast in my book. I have the original redlining map, and then where blacks had gone in 1940 and 1960, and they are almost identical. So basically, if you lived in a yellow transitional neighborhood or in red, you were at the mercy of speculators.
Yeah.
And it worked both ways. I mean, since you could not get bank financing, white people wanting to move to those neighborhoods couldn't do it. Banks in those days did not lend to blacks to begin with, so their only avenue were speculators.
Yeah. Which means that in effect, that decision by the Roosevelt administration to do that really, I guess the right word probably would be condemned a significant part of many American cities to financial deterioration?
It did, and simultaneously what happened was that the guidelines under which these maps were prepared, Homer Hoyt was the chief economist of Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and he actually prepared a list of nationalities in their order of real estate desirability.
This was the head.
Number one, Anglo-Saxons, Nordics, and then it declined. And at the bottom of that list were blacks and Mexicans. And Hoyt was very, very frank about it. He said that there may be no real justification for this kind of bigotry. But if the arrival of a black family in a neighborhood causes panic and a drop in real estate prices, then this is something that the real estate trade has to take into account. And this list was reprinted in appraisal handbooks until the 1960s.
To the 1960s?
Yes. So we have come a long way.
We have come a long way because that is now illegal.
Yes.
And has been illegal in various ways since 1968, the Fair Housing Act, but as recently strengthened, and now we have, fortunately, a strong network of local and state and federal agencies that enforce the law.
Well, what I also do, I bring this up to date by talking about what happened during the subprime mortgage crisis.
I was going to ask you, because that's the most recent.
That's the most recent, and if you talk about flipping, I document flipping from the 1940s onward, and so this really, the subprime was the latest illustration of flipping.
Let's talk to people about because flipping can be legal and illegal.
Well, basically the kind of flipping I'm talking about is, let me give you an example. A $7 an hour security guard is dreaming about buying a house. And suddenly she finds a man whose actual name is Chuck Famous. That's the name of the guy. Chuck Famous says, "Hey, lady, I'll sell you a house, $65,000, and these are the financial terms." Now, the financial terms are that the rate is 11% and goes up to 18%, but never can go lower. And the buyer does not know that Chuck Famous had just bought this house for $15,000. And so clearly you can say, well, listen, the buyer has some responsibilities too, and I agree. But I mean, this is what happened, and so this was flipping.
Yes, yes, and that type of illegal, unethical activity hit Baltimore very hard.
It hit Baltimore very hard before the subprime crisis, and after the subprime became the instrument of financing.
Do you think the flipping set up the subprime problems?
Well, the subprime was nationwide, but what subprime did and what flipping did was that it basically introduced certain criminal practices into this kind of real estate activity. For instance, payoffs to appraisers, some consideration to underwriters, that type of a thing. So that the whole process was corrupted.
Yeah, yeah. We mentioned one question you had. What was another question that you wanted to answer by the book?
Well, I mean, we talk about Baltimore as a city of neighborhoods,
Yes.
And we assume that every neighborhood basically has always been what it was, and that's not the case. But let me just go back to the redlining thing to underscore this neighborhood aspect. The federal government basically in the mid-1930s said that when a neighborhood begins declining, there is no recovery. So let's look at Baltimore today. Bolton Hill, Reservoir Hill, Federal Hill, Canton, Highlandtown, all of those places were redlined. So today they are among Baltimore's leading revival neighborhoods. This was an outcome that the federal government thought was not possible in the mid-1930s. So this is another measure, yardstick, as to how far we have come.
Yeah, because it's the only thing that made it possible for those neighborhoods to recover was getting rid of the redlining. So that,
getting investment money so that people could get some money.
Right. Yeah. And that same process, unfortunately, has gone on in all these other cities across the country.
It has. Now, what subprimed it is kind of interesting. Many scholars feel that subprime increased segregation, and it may have, but it also had two other consequences. Number one, it became the ticket for lots of blacks to buy in the suburbs. Suddenly there was money available, even though the terms may have been predatory, but there was money available. And you see it particularly in Oakland, California, where a majority black city has become a city where blacks now are 1/3 of the population. Meanwhile, the surrounding counties have all increased their black population tremendously. The other thing, the flip side of this was that Harlem. My book begins in Harlem because that was my first, the first neighborhood that I encountered in the United States.
That's where you got off the boat.
That's why I got, well, it wasn't really, but there had been a small Finnish community of a couple of thousand in Harlem until the 1950s. So in 1964, when I visited New York for the first time, I went to see what had happened. There were very few relics. But in any case, whites would not touch Harlem for many decades. And then suddenly the real estate market of Manhattan became so expensive that people began looking at cheaper alternatives. And subprime became the vehicle, risk-taking. Banks were taking risks. They were willing to take risks. So if you wanted to buy a condo or a house in Harlem, suddenly financing was available.
And you can do it.
You could do it.
Yeah.
And so the consequence is that there are now many areas of Harlem that are becoming majority white again.
And I guess the nearness of the universities. And
absolutely.
et cetera,
I mean, the whole Columbia situation is a very controversial situation.
And the black community moves somewhere else.
The black community moves to the suburbs.
Which is, of course, compromised by subprime defaulting, which is what we're in now. Which is what we're in now. And I guess to a certain extent, that's what we're in Baltimore, too.
Yep.
In the Baltimore County and the Howard County and Anne Arundel and Hartford and the rest that we've been hearing about. Did anything in your book, in the research that you did as part of this book, and I know you've been doing research in this for at least 35 years, point you to the future? Trends that you see that are rolling towards...
The future is unpredictable, of course. But at the same time, we know what the future looks like. It looks like Barack Obama. Meaning that if you look at the generation now growing up, the millennial generation, it is totally different from any previous generation. It is far more minority, however minority is defined. The current generation is 25% minority, including Latinos. The millennial generation is 45%. Now, combine that with the revolutionary changes that are happening in the behavior of the millennial generation, instant communication, viewing community not as a place, but as a shared interest.
Yeah,
and you can see that this is going to be a very different country.
Yeah, yeah. And it means that some of the bigotry, some of the important factors that have made Baltimore change the way it has will not make a change in the future, such as bigotry?
Well, bigotry is going to continue, but what is remarkable is that the kind of infrastructure of scientific racism that eugenics provided, and which I discuss in the book, that's gone. There are people who are bigoted, there are people who are racists, but they really don't have any common base at this point. Now, could such a base develop again? Perhaps. But at the same time, bigotry today, most people know is illegal. Certainly, real estate bigotry has been outlawed.
Yes.
And so things have changed.
We'll hope it continues into the future. And one can buy your book where? Amazon?
Well, Amazon, Barnes Noble. I have a web page if you want to see about the book, see a couple of maps, see a bio. My bio, it's www.anteropietila.com.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
you so much. Unfortunately, we're about out of time. Folks can go and buy your book, Not in My Neighborhood. And they should do it because it's a great book. It's a great book, Antero. Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you, Bill. For
Neighborhood Beat, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank our guest, Mr. Antero Pietila, who is author of Not in My Neighborhood, a fascinating book that we all should read, for being our guest today. And I want to thank you for tuning in. Let's try to be a good neighbor out there in all of our neighborhoods, and we'll see you next time.